A very good evening to all of you. Uh, I wish to welcome all of you to this event at Pune International Center. I am Director PIC, Abhay Vaidya. So we are honored to have with us two distinguished former diplomats to discuss what is indeed a bold and promising new era of partnership between the world's most powerful and the world's most populous democracies. Thank you, Ambassador Navtej Sarna and Shri Vijay Gokhale, for your presence here today. Ambassador Sarna is very well known to Mr. Vijay Gokhale, so in fact, he is the one who's going to introduce him later. I just want to say that Ambassador Sarna is a friend of PIC, and he has spoken at the PIC earlier. He gave an online lecture on the travels and teachings of Guru Nanak at the PIC. This was under PIC's India and the World's Great Religions series that was conceived by our Vice President Dr. Kelkar to underscore India's plurality and diversity. As it so happens, Ambassador Sarna was honored with the Sant Namdev Award yesterday, and that is how he is in the city. Mr. Vijay Gokhale, former Foreign Secretary of India and Trustee PIC, is a prolific writer and author just like Ambassador Sarna. We have had two memorable discussions with Mr. Gokhale at the PIC on his first-hand account of the Tiananmen Square uprising and on how China negotiates with India. These discussions were around the books that he wrote on these subjects. And incidentally, books by Ambassador Sarna and Mr. Gokhale are available outside. So today's discussion comes on the backdrop of Prime Minister Narendra Modi's recent visit to the US and the landmark agreements bringing out the proximity between our two nations. Going beyond security matters, we in the civil society would want to see greater people-to-people engagement, strengthening of our democratic institutions, and collaborations in research, science and technology, innovation, and higher education, which have been agreed upon. These are also the areas in which the PIC works. Indeed, we are happy to have with us our President, Dr. Raghunath Mashelkar, who is passionate about science and technology and innovation. Dr. Raghunath Mashelkar and many of our founder members, research scholars, and student interns are present for this important discussion. Finally, as in all PIC programs, you will have an opportunity to ask questions and engage with our esteemed guests. With these few words, I shall now hand over the floor to Mr. Gokhale.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm delighted to introduce my senior colleague and a friend I've known for 4 decades, Shri Navtej Sarna. I just want to briefly mention a few things about him. Of course, he completed his diplomatic career as our ambassador to the United States, which is and has always been since 1947 the most significant diplomatic representation we have abroad. But he also has a rare distinction which very few diplomats have of serving as ambassador in 2 of the countries that are permanent members of the UN Security Council. So he was also our ambassador, or High Commissioner as we call it, in the United Kingdom or London. Our ambassador in Israel as well. But more importantly, he studied Russian language in Soviet Russia. He has been involved in nuclear disarmament negotiations. And he has also been India's longest serving official spokesperson on foreign affairs. Now, in the government of India, there is an arrangement whereby there is the principal information officer who is the spokesperson for the whole of government. But the Ministry of External Affairs has always had a separate spokesperson on foreign affairs, perhaps because Pandit Nehru was the first prime minister and also the foreign minister. When you have to face the press every day and you have to return back to the office and you don't know whether you have upset the prime minister, the foreign secretary, and half a dozen other members of the cabinet, then to survive for, I think, 6 years, you must have some stamina as well as a great ability to forget anything that anybody tells you. And therefore, I really felt, ladies and gentlemen, that rather than simply inviting Mr. Sarna to give a speech on Indo-US relations, because of course we must touch on it, Prime Minister has made a significant visit to the United States, we would use this opportunity to talk to Mr. Sarna about many things and ask him to tell us about his views on them. Because not only has he had an interesting diplomatic career, but he's one of the very, very few people who, while very junior in government service, was also an author of issues completely unrelated to diplomacy. And, in the 1980s and 90s, you would see articles in most of the major newspapers written by him. And of course, subsequently, he has written a whole set of books, many of which are outside, both fiction, including his latest book, Crimson Spring, which is set in the Jallianwala Bagh tragedy, but is a fictional account, but also non-fiction, including a book on Guru Nanak Dev Ji, as well as on a book on Palestine called Indians at Herod's Gate, which we would like him to talk about. So, given that he's got many interests, I think I'd really like to engage him in a conversation on not just Indo-US relations. But Navtej, if you agree, we have to begin with Indo-US relations because that's supposed to be the topic of today's discussion. Before we come to Prime Minister Modi's very significant visit to Washington and all its implications, I want to ask you, because you have served in Washington at two very different times. The first was 1998 to 2002, when you were the person responsible for press and public affairs. And this was perhaps the lowest point of our relationship with the United States. We had just had our nuclear tests. And then the rise began because you were also there when President Clinton made his state visit to India. And then when you went back as ambassador, we were reaching the peak of a relationship under Obama and Trump. So my question to you is, what were the differences you saw in those two periods? And what is your understanding of the shift that took place between your first assignment, which ended in 2002, and your subsequent assignment, which ended in 2019?
Well, thank you very much, Vijay. And first of all, I'd like to thank you and PIC for getting me here to this very erudite audience, very distinguished personalities in the audience. And as always, a great pleasure to be sharing the stage with you. We're old friends and done many things together in exciting places for the last 40 years and seen some of the major events of foreign policy being enacted out together. So it's a great pleasure to be here and to discuss, and I entirely agree with you. I'm not going to do a speech on India-US. But you did mention this, and quite apart from the present visit, which we can touch upon if required later. I think when I went, I had no idea that I was going to the United States in 1998, but I was fresh off the block from nuclear disarmament discussions, and particularly on the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty in Geneva, and I had gone away for a year to Iran, and I was just sort of settling into a nice house with a swimming pool in Tehran when I got the message that I should be moving to Washington after a year and some months. Now, everybody in MEA thought that I'd fixed it because that's how we think. And also because Iran is supposed to be a bad, difficult place, and Washington's supposed to be this comfortable place. At that moment, things couldn't have been more opposite. Tehran was comfortable, swimming pool, ice creams, kebabs. Washington was anti-India. We had just done the unthinkable. And Clinton had said that we're going to come down on India like a ton of bricks. show these guys what's happening. I was sent there, and I just want to clarify this, not because I was probably the only person in that range who had some experience of press work and some experience of nuclear talks. So they said, okay, we're getting terrible press on nuclear issues in the US. You should go there. And at that time, I think India was just coming out, not in a nice way, out of the 55 years of estrangement with the US. I use that word advisedly because there's a lovely book called Estranged Democracies, written by an ambassador, retired ambassadors, nothing else to do, as you can see, except write books. So there was this Dennis Cooks, who used to actually walk around the embassy and walk around the think tanks, looking a little bemused, a little confused. And when I read that book, I realized why. Because he had written this right from 1941 to 1991, because our association with the US actually started in 41 and not in 47, when we had an agent general posted there, Mr. Bajpai. And he had analyzed everything, and he had shown how we had always somehow been at cross purposes over various issues, personality clashes, unjustified expectations, mutual misunderstandings. And, it was a very interesting period, but when we sort of never stood together except for brief periods. And actually the brief periods coincided when our views coincided on China. But in any case, we were just coming out of that, and the nuclear tests, to my mind, people sort of put this a bit later, but having seen it personally, I think that the reawakening to India started with our nuclear tests. And there was a edit piece by, I think, Selig Harrison, who used to write on India in Washington Post. It was called The Wake Up Call. And it suddenly made people curious about India. So as a press officer, I decided that in the US, nobody's going to come and talk to me. They've got other things to do. You have to pick up the phone and push doors and be ready for being rebuffed. So I still remember one of the earliest days, I just walked into the Washington Post newsroom. It's a big hall with people sitting. And I said, I want to meet the foreign editor. And I went to the foreign editor. He had a desk like others. They didn't even have a visitor's chair. So they sort of pulled something from there. And I said, I want to tell you our story. I want to tell you why we did this. So you had to do a bit crazy things like that. And sort of, but the nice thing about the Americans being that once they see that you've got your intention is good and your intention is honest, you get a fair hearing. And that's what started happening. Now, what India was a curious case at that moment. People said that, yes, these are, these used to be pesky irritants in the 60s, a lot of poor people whom we had to send food to. They couldn't sort out this problem of Kashmir with Pakistan, and we have to continue to balance these chaps. And they are in bed with the Russians. That was the other thing. And we were sort of just coming out of that post-Cold War. You mentioned Clinton's visit. Before that, what happened was that because of the nuclear tests, we started this dialogue, the strategic dialogue, or whatever it was called, between Strobe Talbot and Jaswant Singh. Now, this did clear a lot of cobwebs. They had, I think, 26 or 28 meetings in different capitals in the world, and they got to know each other and to talk about India's ambitions and India's problems and India's constraints, and somehow hit it off together and started something which ended up also with Clinton's visit. Clinton's visit, I was fortunate to see firsthand. I traveled with the White House press corps to India, and Clinton was deeply impressed in that visit. You could see it on his face. I mean, he was dancing with the women in Rajasthan on Holi. He went to Hyderabad, and Chandrababu Naidu took him to Cyberabad and gave him a driving license out of a machine. And, you know, he was sort of, this was India's IT coming of age, India, the colorful country, India's raucous parliament, where he went and he was mobbed when he spoke, and he went back deeply impressed. And then came President Bush, and President Bush was perhaps under the influence of Condoleezza Rice strongly, who had said even during the campaign that we have to build up India for a greater regional balance in Asia. They were already thinking of a rising China. And Bush said that, you know, he called his people together and he said, I want to do something special with India. And that started the high-tech trade discussions that started the next steps in strategic partnership, which ultimately were taken over by the negotiations for the nuclear deal in 2005 and onwards. So this is where we were when I first went there. A bit of confusion, a bit of interest, an economic possibility becoming the real. The reforms had begun to bite. Our IT prowess had become known, particularly with Y2K. You know, before Y2K, our boys were techie coolies. You know, they were cheap labor for programming. And with Y2K, Indians were seen as, the Indians solved this problem for us. So you were very likely at airport to be told, hi, you are an Indian, can you fix my computer? You know, but so from there in the you know, I went back after 16 years or 14 years, and in the meantime a lot had happened. We had got, for instance, we had come out of the nuclear apartheid, which meant not just nuclear, but it meant a lot of other dual-use technologies. And we were now part of the various arms controls regimes which had actually been put into place to keep us out. Our economy had grown and was growing. Our responsible nature as a nuclear state was beyond question. And what had happened was that there was a dehyphenation with Pakistan. So a lot of these things had happened. You were at a far more wider relationship, a wider platform. And an important aspect, and I'll end with that, was the security dimension had come into play. In about till the nuclear deal finished in 2008, we virtually had zero American purchases because everything they wanted, they didn't want to share. And since we got it from the Russians, that made them even more chary of sharing. Because if we give it to you, you will give it to the Russians. Or it'll get to them. But by 2016, we had been declared a major defense partner. It was the only country which has that title, a major defense partner. And then in the years that I was there, we managed to get something called the Strategic Trade Authorization, Category 1, which put you into a very select group of countries which had license-free or easier licensing of dual use. We began to sign we had signed one of the foundational agreements earlier. We began to sign the other three and managed to do that. And our purchases were then about $15–16 billion. Today they are $20 billion, and if you count the Predator deal, it's $23 billion. So that's quite a jump. So it's a qualitative change in the relationship.
Yeah, thank you, Navtej. Now, the other thing is, of course, that when you were appointed by the Prime Minister as ambassador to Washington, Obama was the president. And we were quite sure that Hillary Rodham Clinton was going to be the president. And all of a sudden, of course, we had Donald Trump. I recall us speaking at that time, and I think nobody in India had prepared for Mr. Trump and therefore didn't know either him or many of his advisors. And you were the ambassador in Washington. So I think everyone will be interested in knowing how you coped with the situation when he won that election in November 2016.
You know, it was fantastic because I somehow, I had seen Brexit in London as High Commissioner, and I had sat through the night thinking that Brexit is not going to happen. It's such a stupid idea. Nobody's actually going to. And I was watching television through the night, and at about 3 o'clock or something in the morning, suddenly things started changing, and I woke up and I said, you know, this is actually happening. Now, when I reached there on the 5th of November 2016, Washington, D.C., uh, elections were on the 8th November. Ironically, it was the same day as demonetization. So there was chaos all over. So, I, so on the 8th of November, I started watching the television, and everybody had told me Hillary is winning. That's what I had been briefed. That's what the word was. That's what everybody said. Oh, Hillary, Hillary, this Trump, nobody, whatever. And I got this complete sense of deja vu at about midnight that this is another Brexit in my life. And this, suddenly this Hillary, you know, Trump is beginning to actually win. So I felt like a kind of evil charm, you know, wherever I went. In fact, I got a call from Delhi that the next morning, should we send you to China next? But, the thing was that nobody was prepared for Trump, leave alone Mr. Donald Trump himself. He had no idea that he was going to win because he was in it for a lark. Probably his best case scenario was, this will do good to my business. You know, my hotels and my name and my brand, etc. And he was actually locked up in his in his Trump Tower hotel in New York with a bunch of, you know, close aides, and he had put nothing into place. There was no transition team. The Americans have a very organized system of a transition team. So months before they actually come into power, the serious contender has a transition team. Everybody down to Assistant Secretary of State, which is roughly a joint secretary in our system, is a political appointee. And he's been identified months earlier and named, etc. And everything is planned. So there is a transition teams meet, and there's a handing over 2 months or whatever. And nothing was happening because there was nobody. And of course, we were in Washington, Trump had won, and immediately you start getting calls from Delhi, the foreign secretary wants to come. Or the, you know, the NSA wants to come, or when do you think the prime minister should come? And you can't get an appointment for yourself, leave alone for the prime minister, you know? And because the State Department was completely out of the loop. The protocol had no idea what was happening. And Trump, because Trump was not only a maverick and not known as a political leader, he was also not a Republican in the conventional sense of the term. Because Washington in many ways is, you know, has a rotating door. The Democrats move out, they move out to think tanks and universities. The Republicans move in, etc. And you know that this guy will become Secretary of State, this guy will become more or less. But here, most of the institutional Republicans were not with Trump. And even they didn't know. So nobody could get you appointments. You had to seek strange ways of getting access. One of the things, incidentally, was that diplomats, and I did it, I'm guilty of at least on 2 occasions doing this myself, of hanging around in the lobby of Trump Hotel in Washington, D.C. It's a very fancy bar there, sitting around there having a drink on the chance that the chief of staff of Trump or Steve Bannon or one of those guys who are his close buddies will end up there, and I will buttonhole him and introduce myself. I did manage 1 or 2 guys. But you know, you ended up doing absolutely strange things. Then I realized that industrialists were very close to him. So you had to go to New York and meet top industrialists, and then they would put in a word, and then you would get in to meet somebody in the family or somebody into the White House. So it was a bit like the Wild West all over again. Strange guys started knocking on your doors, like, okay, if I give me a contract for $200,000, I will be your lobbyist. Or I can, you know, if you contribute, you know, $50,000, etc., then we can get you regular appointments through somebody who knows, who meets Trump every day or every week. So all sorts of strange, crass things were happening. The institutions had packed up, and I was not even accredited because I had letter of credentials to Mr. Obama. Because in November, they said, November, Hillary is going to win, Obama will have all the time in the world, you'll get an appointment for credentials. But when we reached there, and Trump had won, Obama didn't want to give anybody time. And there were 14 ambassadors in the same situation with letters for Obama. And then we made a noise, said, look, if, we are diplomats do a lot of nasty things, unlike what our PIC said. So we have all 14 had to get together like a trade union and go and tell the protocol guys, listen, if you don't accredit us, how do we attend Trump's inauguration? Where we have to be. So this foxed them. So then we got a message, you please send your credentials. So we sent our credentials and Obama wrote a letter to each one of us. So I'm probably the only Indian ambassador ever credited with a letter and not a personal meeting. So when, after Trump's inauguration, we made a noise again that what about our photograph? What do I put on my, office table? Because the big thing is in America is that if you become ambassador and you get go for credentials, you're entitled to take your family to the Oval Office to meet the president who spends a fair amount of time with you. And this gets photographs and it's the big thing. Now, of course, they said, okay, you can all get photos with Trump, but no family. So, which was the first blow. Second was that no long time, we came out, the Oval Office has 2 doors. So we were all standing in queue outside. And one by one, we went in there. I got my thumbs up photograph with Trump. He shook hands and said, so, how's Modi? Say hi to him. And I walked. I could hardly send a telegram on that basis. But so that sort of thing was going on. But ultimately, the nice thing was that we did not have an immediate prime minister's visit. There was too much ammo flying around. The Japanese got it, the Japanese were too quickly off the block. They reached New York. They didn't even wait for Trump to reach Washington. And they got badgered. He said nasty things. He said nasty things about the Chinese just before they were landing at Mar-a-Lago. He said he refused to shake Merkel's hand. He gave Theresa May a frosty welcome. So, but by the time we got our prime minister's visit, things had settled down and we had good contacts, particularly in the White House, and we managed to pull it off.
I think you're being modest because we know that a lot of the effort went in building relations with the White House and the State Department in that year before Prime Minister came. But coming to the current visit that the Prime Minister has made to Washington, there is no doubt that both in terms of optics and in terms of substance, this is probably one of the outstanding visits that the current Prime Minister has made in his 2 terms in office. And the press and the media reports both in Washington and in New Delhi reflect that. Of course, the core of that visit revolves around technology. Rather than around politics or even China. It is really about technology, about the jet engine, about the fabs, the semiconductor industry, and a whole about the outer space, the Artemis Accords, and so on. And I'm sure everyone has read about all of that, so I'm not going to ask you to recount that. What I'm going to ask you is, do you think that when all this hype is over, the Americans are now ready to transfer significant elements of technology to India, and it is not simply going to be a buyer-seller relationship, whether it is in defense equipment or in civilian technology?
Well, I agree with you. This is a visit for the scrapbooks. It's got all the bells and whistles and everything, you know, and all the high moments, the intimate dinner, the second opportunity to address the US Congress, which only, I believe, 3 or 4 people like Mandela and Churchill and the Israelis have had. So it had all the, you know, bells and whistles and extremely successful, very wide-ranging in terms of programming. Uh, and I think, you know, there's a very, as you mentioned, technology defining element, and right on top of the, you know, the 58 paragraph joint statement, which covers everything. But clearly, you're absolutely correct. I agree with you that the, the defining element that has been identified for the strategic partnership in the coming years or decades is technology. And this is building upon what was inaugurated in January, the initiative on critical and emerging technologies. Now, this, I think, comes out of 2 or 3 things in this. This is not purely a government to government. It is heavy involvement of private sector, heavy involvement of R&D institutions, startups, academia. So all these elements have to come together for this to you know, really take off. Why this has been done, I mean, we could discuss that separately, or I'll just briefly mention. I think the Americans themselves are looking for partners in technology. And a country like India, when the Americans themselves, you know, if you see post-pandemic, they are de-risking from China. They want this friend-shoring of supply chains. And they don't want this dependence on China for technological innovations or materials or products. So they themselves have launched what they call the CHIPS Act, the Inflation Reduction Act, and so on. So for that, they also need R&D, they also need skilled manpower, and they also need partners. So India does answer to a lot of those boxes. In terms of the transfer of technology you mentioned, I think in particular, this jet engine is the one that has been agreed upon. And although the joint statement doesn't put a figure on it, but the newspapers, etc., have said that 80% transfer of technology. Now, what I understand is that it's not that the rest of the 20% is being refused, but the rest of the 20% doesn't belong to GE. So that is going to be negotiated with different vendors. So ultimately, there is an agreement, at least on this, to transfer this 100% ultimately of the technology. Now, whether this will happen all over the place, it will happen in every case, we can't say. It is a breakthrough in the sense that this kind of thing has never happened before. But when the Artemis Accords, they're going to involve a whole set of new technologies for resourcing from space, for instance. The other technologies, for instance, in the green area, that's going to be another set of things. The entire thing will require close monitoring, breaking through regulatory barriers, export control amendments and clearances, and it's not a one on-off switch. So, because a lot of the technology doesn't even belong to the US government. So the US government may give a signal, but the technology ultimately belongs to a private company. And that has to be pulled. And that is why, if you notice, we have relaunched the strategic trade dialogue at the level of Foreign Secretary to address these issues as they come up. So I think we should regard it as a breakthrough, an important breakthrough. And why, again, it has been done? Again, there is an American interest here. And the American interest is that, as Ukraine has shown, that we have to wean away India from Russia. And the only way we can wean away India from Russia in defense terms is if we supply them what they want. Otherwise, we can't keep saying, no, you can't take from Russia, you can't take from Russia, but we won't give you either. So I think that has sunk home, finally. But it will require very close monitoring. It will be a case-to-case basis, and it will require constant tending.
Before we move on to other topics, I have one more question, and that is, there is a presidential election in 2024, and it is an open question whether the Democrats will win or the Republicans will win, and I presume good planning means we should assume that either can. Do you believe that all these initiatives on science and technology, which the Biden administration has agreed to, will also be supported by a potential Republican president and a potential Republican administration? The question I'm asking is, are these outcomes sustainable in the long term or very limited to the current administration?
I think as far as the strategic agreements are concerned, I think the Republicans would go along happily with this. Because if, you know, in the Trump years, for instance, in the last Republican administration that we saw, we had pretty good going on strategic issues. And essentially, it will come down to what happens to the US-China relationship. If the US-China relationship remains that of, competition with a capital C, then I think we are okay. Because I don't, the experience of the last 25 years shows that the relationship has been going upwards. It doesn't sort of do deep dives on the strategic side. There may be off moments. For instance, in the Trump years, it was trade. It was like a red rag to Trump. Because he was an old-fashioned traditionalist trader who saw that if you are exporting more than I'm exporting, then you are a bad guy. If your trade balance is in your favor, you're a bad guy. If you put tariffs, you're a bad guy. And he would say all sorts of nasty things, which for weeks would give you the impression through the newspapers that the relationship was tanking. But actually on strategic things, we were just moving from one strength to the other. So I wouldn't worry about the elections. I think what we have set into place will go on. There are far too many interests in this. And no matter who the government is, I think their view of India as a regional balancer, however real it might be, however nuanced it might be, because we are not the kind of regional balancer who will pull out Air Force and rush to Taiwan if they are rushing. But, but still, I don't think they will disinvest from what has been done. How quickly this moves ahead, I would worry about other things. I would worry about the export controls. I would worry about our ability to absorb this technology. I would worry about our ability for our firms to actually make use of the opportunities that is being given. So I think that's where it is.
So I'm also going to take advantage of the fact that you were High Commissioner in London to ask you a question on Anglo-American relations, because in the Pacific or in the Indo-Pacific, aside from the partners that the United States is looking at, India, Japan, Australia, Vietnam, and the Philippines, there is one new element which has come in, and that is the United Kingdom has returned or aspires to return back to the Pacific from which it withdrew after the return of Hong Kong to the Chinese under the so-called AUKUS, Australia, United Kingdom, US initiative. Since you have been High Commissioner in London and Ambassador in Washington, is this still the sort of very, very close alliance that it has been for many, many years after the Second World War and the Cold War? And therefore, is this a very significant new step that we should also be looking at or certainly studying when it comes to Indo-Pacific security matters?
Well, Vijay, my stay in London was woefully short. I only saw one Wimbledon. So, I'm not, I'm not the best person to answer this question, but what I can say is that relationship in its essence holds in terms of their security arrangements, in terms of their intelligence sharing, in terms of their expectations of each other. I think it is still a special relationship. Uh, and if they, I think what is really, there's no problem. The British will want to come into the Pacific, Indo-Pacific. The French want to come in. And, everybody thinks that this is the new arena of competition and happenings, and, we have to be around here. What is questionable is British capacity at the moment. Because, even within Britain, there are questions being raised as to, look at what's happening inside the country and you want to go to the Indo-Pacific. I mean, the way their fundamental services are collapsing, whether it's the railways or the health service, etc., etc. So I think those are the kind of pressures. Otherwise, a European presence, I mean, not that both things can't happen. They can crack up internally and still be in the Indo-Pacific. That's how countries work. But I think the British will want to play a role, and our relationship with the UK has sufficient depth now that we've identified a good roadmap for the next 10 years or so to actually build on this, piggyback on all that we have done with the Americans. And I don't see we no longer should see the British presence in the Indo-Pacific as a threat to India. I mean, they would be partners today. The days of when the British Navy ruled the waves and came to raid us are far behind us.
Well, I am glad to hear that, but I'm not sure that Dr. Uday Kulkarni will agree. Anyway.
He's a historian, so he comes from a historical point of view.
Yeah. Can I shift focus to your experience as the spokesman of the foreign ministry? Because I think there's very little, I mean, we should take the opportunity of your being here for people outside Delhi to understand how the Ministry of External Affairs also functions. So could you tell us, I mean, as the spokesman of the foreign ministry, sort of what were the pressures that you would operate under? What were the challenges that you faced in dealing with the media in those 6 years? And sort of, I mean, how did you cope with this? Because, I mean, meeting the press once in a month or having an interaction casually is one thing. Meeting the media every single day and giving them access to your room at any time, which is what is traditionally the spokesman's sort of activity, is quite another thing. So where were the boundaries? How did you deal with them? And I ask this because it has been my impression that we are relatively less proficient in projecting our image abroad as compared to the Chinese and the Pakistanis. I'm not talking about the Americans, they're very good, but the countries with which we have adversarial relations are able to project themselves better than we are. So sort of what were the challenges and pressures you faced, and how should we deal with the question of better projection?
Thank you. That's a huge set of questions. Let me say one thing, that, I've always thought that dealing with the press as a diplomat is a very, very personal thing. In the sense, you will find 10 diplomats and each one of them will have his different style, approach, willingness, ability, and so on. And ultimately, what's happened to the spokesman's office also is that the way we institutionalized it and the way it developed it has a lot of the time depended upon the incumbent of the office. And also on the political masters and the foreign secretaries of the day, how they sort of gave you that space. Now, I can't talk of what's happening today because I think I haven't been in touch for the last 5 years. But in our days, which is now about 15 years ago, I think we had developed a highly proficient, efficient sort of division, which was, you know, very open to the press. So the first thing was that you had to take a decision that, am I here to, you know, as a normal diplomat, your normal thing is that my work is secret. I deal in telegrams. I write top secret on top of my papers. And all these guys who are journalists, they are here to stab me in the back and publish this story. Now, if you have that attitude, you should stay away from press work. You do yourself a service and the press. So you have to come to it with a mind that, listen, I have to build relationships where I can convince the journalist that I am telling him what I can tell him, even if I know more. These are the terms of engagement. This is of on record, off record, background, to be quoted, not to be quoted. And then he should be able to understand that this chap is basically a good chap. He's trying to tell me what he can. I shouldn't push him beyond this time. I'll try and sneak around South Block and try to get bits and pieces more. And that's how, these are the kinds. So I've always believed that the relationship between the press and diplomats is what matters. And relationships grow. That's why, you know, you may have met somebody. I met somebody when I was OST Press Relations in 84, 85. He was the New York Times man in Delhi. And I made friends with him. I was 3 or 4 years in service. When I reached Washington at the time of the Kargil war, the ambassador wanted to actually go into New York Times and talk to the editorial board, and I started looking around, and I found that the guy who wrote the edits on South Asia was the same person, Steve Weissman, who had been in Delhi. So I called him up, and I said, you probably don't recognize me, but I want to come and say hello to you. I used to know you. He said, I think I recognize you. Come over. I took a train. I went to New York. I went to the top floor of New York Times and met him. And he said, yes, you know, we've met. So we re-established our relationship. The ambassador could actually go in with maps and everything and show where the Pakistanis had come in and how India had not crossed the LOC and all that. And we actually changed the way the New York Times was reporting what was happening in Kargil. So, you know, so these are the sort of things as far as a spokesman is concerned. In those days as spokesman, I think the challenges was to actually make the friend your, press your partner, particularly on Pakistan. See, I had come into the job soon after the disaster at Agra. Because Agra, one of the worst things that happened was that India did not do a briefing at night. Because the press kept waiting all day. And the Pakistanis kept going out and, pumping flesh and slapping backs and chatting with the press. And the Indians did not do so. And they said, no briefing, no briefing. So the poor spokesperson, when she actually came at night and said, no briefing, she was actually manhandled because the press was so angry. So then when we went to Pakistan in 2004 for the Vajpayee visit, we took 375 journalists with us. We took 2 plane loads. Our division in Shastri Bhavan actually looked like an Indian Airlines office. And we took them, we set up a media center on the top of Holiday Inn in Islamabad. All the Pakistani journalists also came there because it was more happening place. And all I got was a commitment from our seniors, the High Commissioner, the NSA, the Foreign Minister, that even if you have nothing to say, one of you will come every few hours to the media center. And they agreed. And each one of them came by turns, met the press, said what they had to, and ultimately it was the Pakistani press center which was lying vacant in the same hotel. So I think it's a lot of it is a question of how you approach the press, the weaknesses we have in our system, and now I'm sure they've improved over the years because this thing has got institutionalized more and more, is for the spokesperson to get information himself. You know, before I took over the job and I was in Washington, my first stay, I actually requested the State Department spokesperson that I want to sit in on your preparation. How do you prepare? So he invited me. I went to the State Department, and before he went in for a briefing, he was sitting in a hall like this. And there were chairs where there were press officers from every division of the State Department. Every division there has a press officer who comes in early morning, anticipates the questions of the day, prepares answers, gets political clearance for those answers at the appropriate level, and turns up for the spokesperson's briefing at about 11 o'clock. And then the spokesperson calls each one of them. They come here, they show him the questions, answers, he puts them in a file alphabetically, and they go away. And then he goes into the briefing, and suppose he's asked about Haiti, he'll look at Haiti. If there is nothing there, he says, I don't have anything, I'll come back tomorrow. If he has, he will answer to the best of his ability. And he told me, he says, I will come back and I will destroy this folder. Because even by mistake, I don't want to take it in tomorrow. They will come in again and tell me tomorrow. Now, nothing like this happens in MEA, believe me. I used to get up in the morning and anticipate questions, whether they were ranging from China to Peru, you know, and then I would contact the concerned Joint Secretary. There was Joint Secretary East Asia and Joint Secretary Pakistan, and say, this could come up, can I say something? And then if they were nice and they were friendly, they would actually give me an answer. And they say, no, I need to clear this with the Foreign Secretary. I'll let you know by 3 o'clock. And so on. So this goes on through the day. And there were some Joint Secretaries who say, no, I have nothing to say. And then they themselves would go to the press and talk to the press because they would like to make friends with a particular journalist. So, you know, so you have to guard against what I used to call internal trading. You know, this is internal trading. So internal trading, backstabbing, all sorts of things used to happen. So yes, I did go very grey in those 6 years.
Yeah, so maybe we should open the floor for questions, but before that, I want to ask you on the other career that you had, even when you were in the government, and of course subsequently of your writings. And so I'd like you to tell them a bit about your book called Indians at Herod's Gate, because you were ambassador to Israel, I think, when you wrote the book, or when the idea to write the book came. And it struck me that you didn't write a book about India-Israel relations or politics of Israel, but about something very cultural and something very historical. So I want you to share some, you know, about this book, and also about your recent book, Crimson Spring, which is a fictional account, but based on the Jallianwala Bagh tragedy, and which has, of course, won the Kalinga Award and other recognitions. So if you could talk about these two books.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Vijay. I think they're two very different books. But let me start with the Indians at Herod's Gate. I was posted to Israel in 2008, and just before that, I had seen an old newspaper cutting and about an Indian hospice in Old Jerusalem, where Baba Farid from Punjab had gone in the 12th century. Now, Baba Sheikh Farid was one of the Sufi of the Chishti order. He was after Moinuddin Chishti and Bakhtiyar Kaki, Baba Farid was the next big awliya of the Sufis. So when I went to Israel, I tried to find this place, and I landed up there. And I tried to look whether we had any files on this, and I did find some papers in our embassy on it. Now, this is a very complicated set of geography and political, geographical, historical sort of landscape, so I don't want to take too much time. But very briefly, I will say that in the old city of Jerusalem, which is all of a kilometer square, it is the most disputed kind of landscape you can find in the world, or space you can find in the world, for several reasons. One, of course, till 67, the Jordanians controlled it. In 67, the Israelis took it over and made it they call it their capital, forevermore, the permanent capital, because Jerusalem in Judaism is where the soul of the Jewish faith resides. It's also very important because it has the holiest place for the Jews. And within the old city, there is that, the Temple Mount, what is called, or the Haram al-Sharif, which is just a big platform where the Jews believe they had the temples. The Solomon's temple, the second temple, and the temple which was destroyed, the second temple which was destroyed, and the temple that was destroyed by King Herod, roughly around the time of Jesus Christ. So for them, it's the holiest place. In the same area, just off the platform, is the Holy Sepulchre Church, which is Calvary. It is the rock on which Jesus Christ, the hill on which Jesus Christ was crucified. So it's extremely serious place. Then you see the symbol of Jerusalem, the Golden Dome. Now that is not actually a mosque. It's a shrine. And under it is a rock. If you go down to the basement, there's a huge spreading rock. Now, the Muslims believe that Prophet Muhammad went to heaven on his night journey from that rock, met all the prophets, met God, came back with the messages for his people, and then started proclaiming. And right next to it is the Al-Aqsa Mosque, which is the third holiest shrine for the Muslims after Mecca and Medina. Now, all this is within 100 meters or 200, 150 meters of this Indian hospice, where Baba Farid went and meditated in a cellar for 40 days in the late 1200, around 1200. So when I went there, I found this family, an old man who was then about 81, 82. He was not so old, sprightly, straight, well-dressed, well-spoken, and I started digging his story. And over the next 2.5 years, I would, whenever I could find time, I would go sit with them, lovely family, and look at the hospice and look at all the papers they didn't know the history. When I started researching, they started researching with me. We went into old Ottoman documents, we found old maps, we found all sorts of things with the help of his son to show how that hospice had come together, what was the connection with India. So after Baba Farid went, then every year his chelas started going there because it was on the way to the Hajj. Either the way to the Hajj or way back from the Hajj, people would go to Jerusalem, then they would go by camels across the desert and all that. So people would stay there, and these hospices are like dharamsalas, where pilgrims go. They are given a place to cook their food, they eat their food, they sleep, they leave some chanda after that. Here is 20 rupees or 40 rupees or whatever the equivalent was. So we traced all that, and along with that, I tried to trace what was happening to Jerusalem. I tried to trace particularly the history of this family for the last 100 years. Now, how this family came to be is it's half Indian. Sheikh Munir, who's still around at about 95, he's half Indian, half Palestinian, half Indian. Now, what happened was this hospice, to cut a long story short, after the end of the Ottoman Empire, when the Turks left, the British mandate came over Jerusalem, and the Mufti of Jerusalem said that I need money to repair the Al-Aqsa Mosque. So he sent a high-level delegation to India because the Indian Muslim princes were the richest. That go and get some money from India. So when they came here, they met all the Muslim leaders. They met, M.A. Ansari, they met Ajmal Khan, they met all those people. And they told them that there is this Indian property lying in complete, disarray. Why don't you send somebody to look after it? So they said, okay. They got one Nazir Ansari. He was a small, sort of daroga from Saharanpur and from Deoband, and said, you go. So he left his wife and two daughters here and went off. When he reached there, the Palestinians started thinking he's a good chap, let him keep. He started working hard in the typical Indian sense, putting the place into order, rebuilding. They said the only way to keep him here is get him married. So they got him married to a Palestinian girl. And he started another family there. And Sheikh Munir was his eldest son, who then took over as the director. It was a Waqf property ultimately. So he took over as the director in 53 and then saw this hospice grow. Of course, pilgrims were kept coming till 67. When the Israelis took over, it became difficult for Muslim pilgrims to go. Then people, they got bombed in the 67. Part of the family was killed. And all this happened during World War II. It became a R&R center for our soldiers in the area. They started coming to live there. So it's a fascinating history. So what I tried to do in this book is somehow bring this together in a readable form through various conversations and, try to tell it as lightly as I could because it is a complicated story. So it's been very rewarding, not just for me, but for the hospice, because the hospice has now come on the map. The BBC did a documentary after the book. Lots of people visit there. All our people go, all the ministers who go to Tel Aviv go there. So it's now come on the map. Fortunately, the book is now going into Arabic, so hopefully the readership will also increase. The second book, Crimson Spring, you mentioned, that is also, I see copies outside. That came out last year. That was a far more, it took a many more years of research. But that's essentially a book, I would say, on early 20th century Punjab. It's a historical fiction of the period. I've centered it around the Jallianwala Bagh massacre. But then I realized when I started reading more and more about those times that it wasn't just a massacre. It wasn't a discrete standalone event. There were several other things happening, as is normal, in historical events just don't happen and vanish. They sort of other things happen. So I tried to pull into this book through various narrators and various characters the different historical trends that were flowing in. For instance, a lot of the Sikh soldiers were coming back from World War I. The largest contribution to World War I was from Punjab. So they were coming back. What were their experiences? What were they feeling, etc. Then there were the Ghadarites who were coming back from Canada and the west coast of America. And so what were they going through? So I've tried to bring in those. I've tried to bring in the local freedom fighters. I've tried to bring in the beginning of Satyagraha. I've tried to bring in the revival of the Sikh identity that was happening through the Singh Sabha movement in the early 20th century. And along with that, I've tried to sort of capture some, what were the life in villages like, what was the language, what was the food, what was the atmosphere, what was the relationship between the different communities. And all this is told through, of course, and the revolutionaries, because a major character in the book is Udham Singh. So the book sort of goes full circle from Jallianwala Bagh to the shooting of Michael O'Dwyer by Udham Singh in 1940 in Jalandhar. And it's all told as fictional fiction. I'll only clarify that it is fiction in the gaps. There's no distortion of history. History is as it was. I've magnified characters who were not important, who were not fixed, who were not real characters. The real characters have been kept to their real height and weight. But the other guys have got magnified, other narrators have been created, and so on and so forth. So, well, I hope you read it.
Thank you, Navtej. Maybe we can just open the floor for questions now. So, can somebody pass the mic? Yeah. Please, go ahead.
Hello. Yeah. Thank you, Ambassador, for the excellent anecdotes that you have given. My name is Rahul. I am a PhD candidate at Center for International Politics Organization Disarmament, School of International Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University. And my question to you regards to the divergences in world conception that both India, New Delhi, and Washington hold. For example, for instance, India believes in multi-alignment, and we have that strategic autonomy that has been given to us by Jawaharlal Nehru, and we believe in a multipolar world order, but that strongly and grossly misaligns with United States conception of world hegemony and whatever it wanted in the Indo-Pacific. So my question is, how do you think these two particular democracies will reconcile their diverging world visions that they have, and how do you think Washington will be able to negotiate with India's world vision that we have? My second question is regarding that you told that you clarified about the Washington's intent to make India a regional hegemon, a regional balancer in South Asia. My point is whether does India is ready for that particular role, or do we take that particular role seriously? Because we have recent excellent book by Manjari Chatterjee Biller, who argued that India is not ready to basically become a great power yet, and we don't hold China as a threat, and it has been proved at different occasions. So my question is, does India ready for that role of regional balancer yet? Because there are evidences where we are only concerned mostly about, if you take about the foreign policy goals that we have, that we basically wanted our to increase per capita income, GDP and all, but not so much focus on China as a threat to our territorial integrity and all. So these two are my questions. Thank you.
I think I should pass these questions to Ambassador Gokhale, but let me try. I think as far as your first question is concerned, this is not a new concern. You know, we've been non-aligned even before we became independent. Jawaharlal Nehru made it very clear what free India's foreign policy was going to be. And the Americans have never found it very convenient, right? Famously, John Foster Dulles said that this is short-sighted and immoral, you know. So not nice things were said about non-alignment, but we did not have any choice. And we did what we did. Today we call it strategic autonomy, in the non-aligned 2.0. You clothe it in whatever garb you want. Essentially, it means is that we will do what we need to do for our interest on a particular issue, right? Today that we may be aligned with you, tomorrow we may not be aligned with you because it doesn't serve our national interest. That essentially is what is strategic autonomy. Now, whether we can carry that on and keep the Americans happy, that's your question. Now, yes and no. Sometimes we will have to do sufficient things because these are not static. It's not a zero sum that today are we happy or not. Okay, you know, we have now bought Russian oil and we have managed to keep the Americans fairly happy for them to give this complete red carpet to Prime Minister Modi. So, you know, this is what diplomacy is all about. The Americans, frankly, the American administration understands, even though it is unhappy about it, that the Indians will keep on playing this strategic autonomy game. So we will continue and they will try to keep us more and more in their fold together as long as it suits them and as long as they need to. Leads you into the second question. Why do they need to have us as a regional balancer? Why do they need a balance here? Because they are not the hegemon in the Indo-Pacific as clearly as they were perhaps 20 years ago. There is another hegemon who is said it openly and clearly that we are going to compete with you in every sphere. Now, so they will want to gather everybody, even if you are 60% with them or 70% with them. Even if you are, they know that you will not fight with the American forces in Taiwan, right? But you might give them basing facilities, you might give them overflight, you might give them repair and maintenance under this mastership agreement that you have just signed. So you are a country which is for your own interests. And this again is something that your last part I don't agree with, that we don't see China as a threat. We very much see China as a threat. I mean, more than this, would be war. So we see China as a threat. What we are trying to do is build up our not play America's script on China, but build up our capabilities with American assistance to be able to take on China on our own. Now, will that happen? Will that not happen? Only he knows.
Ambassador Sarna, Amit Pranspe, I'm a PIC member. Absolutely fascinating conversation and a great format as well, much better than a lecture as you had suggested. So I have way too many questions, but I'll stick with one for now. I was fresh in the US in the 90s when the tests happened, May of 98. And I remember watching some of the interviews that the then Ambassador Chandra was giving, and I thought he handled it really well.
Very well.
And of course, reading some of his interviews as well. So I know you briefly talked about it, but I would like to hear a little bit more about that from you, that era, because since you joined that era just after that, I think. I don't know the exact
I was
timeline.
with him. I was his press officer.
So then I definitely want to hear a little bit more about that part.
You see, when we tested in May, I reached 3 months after that. And Ambassador Chandra had already started his TV. And he told me later, because I worked with him for about 2.5 years, he didn't need to wait for any instructions. He was very senior. He had political backing in Delhi. And he was very confident of what he wanted to do. So he would, he went on the front foot. And he explained India's position, etc. So when I reached there, I think one of the first things, I used to get calls from CNN and ABC and BBC and everything. We want the ambassador, we want. So he had given me clear instructions. If CNN calls, you just accept. Whatever time, whatever day, I will go. So promptly I would say it, he would say, "Theek hai." I would park my car in his house, sit in the ambassador's car, and we would drive off to the CNN. And he was a big man, and they'd sit in the CNN studio and try to do makeup, and say, "Iski kya zarurat hai?" And the only thing I started objecting to is after the Pakistanis tested, the CNN used to like this monkey show. Get the Indians, get the Pakistanis, let them fight, we will watch. So it happened a couple of times. It became embarrassing because that Malia Lodi and Riaz Khokar or one of them would come and sit in the same dressing room. Both of them are sitting like this and getting made up. It became a little difficult. So I then started, with his approval, I started objecting to CNN. I said, we will come, but we will come alone. You can get the Pakistanis 15 minutes later. But we are not going to be putting up this monkey show for you, And so, and he was a very clear-headed person. There was no confusion in his head. He was one of those diplomats I spoke about, although he was not a career diplomat, he was from the IAS. He was always willing to meet any pressman. Even, what we call the ethnic press in the US, the famous India Abroad and there's some of those newspapers which used to leave, you get free in the Indian market, in the sabzi, next to the sabzi, they keep the newspaper. He would meet those guys also. And he would not let a thing go unchallenged. That was the other thing. a lot of negative press would appear. He would tell me, chitti likhiye. So I wrote umpteen letters to the editor of Washington Post, New York Times, Washington Times. They would get printed, some would not get printed. He said, don't worry, if they're not printed, you must write and put it on record. So every time the India map, you know, and these things get into your DNA somewhere because, you know, whenever I speak to young officers, I tell them don't ever let it go unchallenged. If your map is wrong, go and object in writing and leave it somewhere so that it goes into some record. 10 years later, somebody will be researching those records. You know, some PhD scholar will actually be looking at those files. So he was that sort of a person, and and he was very close to Mr. Jaswant Singh. So even in that dialogue, he played a great role.
Thank you, Ambassador Sarna and Gokhale, for such an insightful session. My name is Ritik, and I'm a research assistant with Kubernetes Initiative. My question is actually on the economic pillar of the India-US relationship. As you noted, the defense and security pillar in many ways has become front and center of the bilateral relationship. So my question to you is, how do you see the state of the economic pillar currently, and in the long game going forward, fully pun intended, the economic pillar of the bilateral relationship?
I think the economic pillar is in a sense very important because you know, if you take away China and suppose all this other stuff, why is the US interested in India? Several reasons, but one of the main reasons is India as a growing economy. And this interest started perking up with our reforms, you know. So we are seen as a huge future market. You know, willy-nilly we are going to end up as the third largest economy in the world. Our trade has actually gone up significantly. We are about $191 billion. And, you know, all sorts of targets have been set, 500 billion and so on. I don't know how much we will do, but a lot of this other stuff that I spoke about, the technology and all, is in the private sector. So this is also a trade generator. Now, there are differences like in any two trades. And we are constantly have to resolve them. I think in this visit, a significant move has been made by resolving, I think, 6 of those WTO perennial issues, which were about tariffs, retaliatory tariffs, subsidies, and so on, the usual suspects. So 6 of those have gone. But they're still, you know, if you see the 2023, there's a foreign trade barrier report of the USTR, which has 13 pages on India. And I cursorily looked at the number of pages for other countries. The only country that beats us is Indonesia. So there are a lot of trade barriers, a lot of market access barriers, tariff issues, quality issues, which are small but irritating. So usually what happens is that in a strategic relationship, these elements get absorbed into what has been termed as strategic generosity. That I need you so much more in other issues, ye chalta rahega, you know, which is the right way to do. Trump was the one exception who put these right on top and would talk about zero tariff, 100% for Harley Davidson, this, that, all that, you know, mangoes and almonds. I mean, you know, there was once, and since this is an evening of anecdotes, evidently there was once, we had so little in the relationship at one stage that evidently, probably Dr. Mashalkar may have a better idea of this, but Narasimha Rao went to Washington and met Clinton. And after a few minutes, they ran out of conversation because the relationship was thin and there wasn't much to discuss. So he turned to his USTR, the name is escaping me at the moment, and said, do you have anything to say? And he was taken by surprise. He hadn't prepared anything. So he said, almonds, you know. So one word, almonds. Now that wretched almonds is still there. is Californian almonds, is that problem is still there from 91 to today, you know. So there are these things, but I think the prospects for trade are much better because their basket of, you know, this technology, space, yeah, all this will add to your trade. But we can't just sit back and say कि ये हो गया, or say कि GSP नहीं मिलेगा तो we are finished. No, GSP, what is GSP? It's $5 billion. You know, we make a hoo-ha about it. It's a non-issue. You know, it's $5 billion. But it makes us sound like a developing country, which gives us advantages in other places. So we'll have to keep chipping away at it. That's where it is.
Thank you, Ambassador Sarna, and thank you, Vijay Gokhale, sir, for a wonderful conversation. My name is Sridhar Publicity. I am the Senior Director at MIT School of Government. Looking at the positive highs, the recent thing has been the America looking away for the Russian oil that we are getting, right? Thankfully, that's a good cushion for us to have. But how do you see it going the next 20 years? Because the energy basket is going to change. A lot of technology innovation is going to happen. Will we be shoulder to shoulder in that new transition? That's the first question. The second question I have is, I remember the cold days in Stockholm when I was a student there in 2007, where the Indo-US nuclear deal was being discussed, and we were not very convinced as a large amount of Indians. But I met a junior officer from the Hill who was at SIPRI in one of the evenings, and we were talking, and he said, Sridhar, this is the best US can ever give for India as far as civil nuclear deal is concerned. And we all know that it didn't land well here, right? We don't have massive fruits of it with us. You also mentioned that there are going to be a lot of absorption challenges in all the talk that we have been having now. So how do you see we can do that better? And you did talk about the academia playing a bigger role. So any further thoughts on that?
Well, I think more or less you explained it yourself, Sridhar. But on the first issue, I think the energy basket has to change. But for the foreseeable future, India is going to be fossil fuel dependent. So, you know, we can talk green, we can't do green beyond a point, you know. So oil, coal, gas for our forthcoming, and we may have transition. You know, I think a lot of the technologies will go towards adaptation rather than, you know, complete ending. And so if you see the joint statement, there are a number of initiatives on working together on green hydrogen, on buses, on EVs. Very important aspect there, which doesn't get picked up in the media too much. I found it very important. There is an agreement. We've been admitted into this small thing of minerals, mineral securities, which is essentially an EU kind of thing, in which, you know, we can then get into the thing of exploring, commercializing, you know, stuff which, for instance, China is now holding back a couple of these from the US, and so which are going to be the fuels of the future. On your second question, I think the nuclear deal was a big thing. It did not result in nuclear energy because from America, because we haven't been able to get through the nuclear reactors. But it opened the doors for others. Even the Russians couldn't have done what they're doing without that, us clearing those hurdles. The French. We're getting uranium from the Kazakhs. We couldn't have done all this. So, you know, it has removed us from nuclear apartheid and also admitted us into the other control agreements. Now, these new technologies, how we absorb them is going to depend upon our capacity, our development, our R&D. I think our R&D budgets are abysmal. And they're probably going down. Somebody told me they've gone from 1 to 0.6. 0.68%. Now we're a country like in 1998, it was 0.7%. Today it is 0.68%. Yeah. So, you know, if we keep doing this, now, for instance, this 5G, you know, China has half the world's infrastructure in 5G, and we have 1%. You know, I was seeing these figures, some AI patents. We have 3%. China has 65%. Now, you know, a lot needs to be done, the ecosystem. Just an MOU is not going to resolve these. So that is why I say there are a lot of good intentions, there are a lot of good beginnings. Let's see how much we can concretize.
Very enlightening discussion. I wish it never ends. But to ask two questions which have not been tackled actually. One is about the two things that India is looking for and for quite some time and not got around to getting any nearer to those goals. First is the permanent membership of the Security Council, and the second is membership of the Nuclear Suppliers Group. So 5 years from now or in the next 5 years, how do you see this going forwards?
Well, at current rates, I don't see it going forward. Things may change. On the permanent seat, I think the world is too preoccupied with other things to be looking at UN reforms. The UN Security Council is actually defunct at the moment. I mean, nothing that the Americans want to say are going to get through the Chinese, or even if it gets through the Chinese, the Russians. So it's not going to happen. And you cannot have a reform of the Security Council seats without everybody coming on board. I think the answer is we have all sort of, you know, it's like what happens in the heart. If your main artery is blocked, you find other routes. And that is what is happening. You found a G20, you found a this, you found a that. You found what I call bespoke coalitions. You know, you have an issue, you make a coalition. You know, so these 4 or 5 countries on this, on that. You have the Quad. You have, so you're playing at the high table in many places without being on the UNSC, and it's there in every statement. It's there in this India-US statement also. So it will, again, we have to keep it boiling. NSG, I think it's only China. And at the moment, I don't think the Chinese are any mood, or we are in any mood to go and ask them. So, you know.
Yes, sir. Good evening, sir. Thank you so much for the wonderful discussion. I'm Isha Pataskar from the Pune University in the Defense and Strategic Studies Department. My special focus currently is on the Indo-Pacific and the activities of the Chinese and the Americans in the Indo-Pacific. So I would like to cut short my question that the Indo-Pacific currently is the focus of many countries, like currently the EU, especially the French, are having many joint naval activities with Indians, and also the US are having a special eye on the resources in the region. And the Chinese, of course, the string of pearl strategy is quite famous for that. So I would like to ask you, how does the US look at the Chinese activities in the Indo-Pacific, specifically the ports which the Chinese are developing, in, like, for example, in Djibouti? And is India likely to play the role of the matchmaker in the upcoming decades in the Indo-Pacific section? Thank you so much.
I think India wants to play a role, but I don't think we want to be the mediator or the matchmaker. The Chinese don't take kindly to our role in the Indo-Pacific. You know, the Quad has been dissed by the Chinese as an Asian NATO, as foam on the ocean which will settle down, and all sorts of things. Now they've started taking it a bit more seriously. So I don't think we are intending at all to do this, because our own security, our own trade, our own influence, not just in the Indo-Pacific on the you know, the South China Sea side, but the Indian Ocean is under threat. the Chinese, for the first time, are developing strong naval assets which they want to deploy in the Indian Ocean. And they are ringing us up, with the famous string of pearls, whether you count the Myanmar ports, the Hebben Tota and Gwadar and Djibouti, and the ones on the Hormuz. There's one more. Just in Iraq. So if you do all that, then we are under threat. So I would say, if anything, our role is going to be sort of cautiously, I would say, without poking the Chinese too much in the eye, to quietly sort of side with the US and get into a situation where we have cooperation with several other countries and can guard our interests. Now, that explains in some ways our cautious attitude to Quad and other things. These are complicated things, so I'll just stop here.
So I think we've run out of time. So Navtej, thank you very much on behalf of all of us for taking this opportunity to come to Pune and talk to all of us. I want to thank Dr. Mashelkar also for gracing the occasion, and for everybody here for taking the trouble. I mean, it's a headache coming to this place. Ganesh Khind has become a nightmare. Frankly, I think Delhi is still better off with the monsoon than we are with Ganesh Khind at the moment. So if all of you have taken the trouble, it's a big effort, and we do appreciate it very much on behalf of PIC. So thank you once again, all of you, for coming, and thank you, Navtej.
Thank you so much.